We will now consider log number 3726 by Mr. Banks. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Will the clerk please distribute the amendment? Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana for the purpose of explaining his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is simple. It would ensure that every military personnel decision, accessions, promotions, and command selections are based solely on merit and without regard to politics, race, color, sex, or religion. This is common sense. It's no different than what is required under the merit system principles of our DoD employees, so why should our service members be treated any differently? Does a person's race make them a better leader? Does a person's party preference disqualify them from command? Of course not. But this administration keeps trying to deny that fact. It is merit and demonstrated performance that should matter, and it's merit and demonstrated performance that should be the only factor in personnel decisions if we want to keep our military apolitical, lethal, and strong. I appreciate your support and consideration of this amendment. With that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes the ranking member.
The problem is it doesn't always come down to merit, and we have a regrettable history of discrimination in this country. And one of the things that we're really trying to accomplish is to recruit from the broadest possible pool of people. And we haven't done a great job on that, whether you're talking about women, members of the LGBT community, or people of color. And you can look at the ranks of senior officers in top positions. Do we really believe that white men, to like 90, they're the only ones who have any merit, apparently, the only ones who are, qualified to do a job? I don't think that's the case. I think because of historical discrimination, different groups are less likely to join the military and participate. And I think that should be something that the military should be allowed to consider. Now, I don't disagree that if you have a situation where that's it, that's, what we're basing it on, that talent, merit, ability isn't factored in at all, then you've got a big problem. And I'll also admit that there are places in this country where that is the approach that they've taken to DEI. I also have some challenges on that back in my own home district in the Seattle-King County area. But that's not what the Department of Defense is doing. What they're trying to do is open up the number of people who can see a future in the military, who can see that they're going to be given a fair shot, that past discrimination isn't going to mean that they're not going to get the same shot at a promotion. And that's what they're trying to do. And I think the Department of Defense has done this in a very reasonable way. And to prohibit that and to block that ability will make it more difficult to recruit and retain people from groups that have been historically discriminated against in this country, because they won't think that they're going to get a fair shot. That is the reason for doing this. It's not to eliminate merit or ability. It's to understand that if you're going to be fair, you have to go beyond that based on the history of this country and the history of service. I think this is a mistake, and I would urge members to vote no on the amendment.
Do we have any? Okay, Mr. Waltz.
And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak in support of this amendment, and I frankly, as much as I respect the ranking member, couldn't disagree more stringently. No cadet, no American should be chosen or not chosen based on their skin color. And unfortunately, in these elite institutions, when you elevate someone for any other reason than merit, then you are not choosing someone who arguably has outperformed them. And we continue to raise these issues because we continue to have cadets, family members, military service members coming to us saying that they were not chosen, demoted, or what have you because of their skin color. And that is unacceptable, and clearly this committee needs to intervene. I just had a case last week, the #1 cadet in an ROTC unit. His entire life had dreamt of being a pilot. He did everything right. He was the top of his class. He was an engineering major. And he was approached by his head of his professor of military science and said they were under a lot of pressure. They had never had an African-American female. And he was now going to be #2 and she was going to be #1. And that cadet has since quit the program and quit the Air Force. And I know that's anecdotal, but it is a steady stream of these cases coming to our office. So clearly, there is an issue. Clearly, there may be something that was good and well-intentioned, something to address past wrongs, and the pendulum has swung too far. I encourage my colleagues, I think, to follow something that is absolutely common sense. We cannot fight past racism with more racism. Merit should be the only consideration. I yield my time.
Chair recognizes Ms. McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, what this amendment does is go farther and say that you can't give any consideration to race or national origin or sex. And in doing so, you leave in place the disproportionate impact that Jim Crow has had on our military. Right now, Black service members make up 9% of active duty service members, but only 6.5% of generals. Blacks make up over 20% of the American population, and in some states even more than that. And yet, because of the history of discrimination and segregation in the military, many are less likely to even want to try to apply. And the way I read this amendment, it would make it more difficult to focus recruitment at HBCUs or to specifically expand the pool of minority individuals who could be recruited. Now, last year I told you all a story about my uncles. I'm gonna remind you of that. I had 8 uncles born and raised in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi between 1918 and 1938. And when they joined the military, because for them, the only option, because they weren't allowed to go to school after the 8th grade because no school educated Black children in Mississippi beyond the 8th grade, their only options were the military or as laborers. When they joined the military, including during World War II, they weren't allowed to fight. They were not allowed combat duty. The only opportunity available to them was as cooks or laborers. And the stories they brought back home to their children about how they were treated, I'm gonna let you guess whether any of their children had any desire to join the military. And I could spend 14 hours talking about the lasting legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and how it has led to this disproportionate representation of minority communities in our military, but I don't have enough time. That disproportionate impact did not go away with the wave of a magic wand when Truman ordered the military desegregated, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, when the Voting Rights Act was passed. Left to its own devices, it cannot be undone. That is not reverse racism. That is redressing the legacy of racism by saying we want our military to reflect the diversity of the country that it protects. We want our officers to reflect the diversity of the country they protect and the men and women that they lead. Because if you can't see someone who looks like you in a position of leadership or in service, you won't feel welcome. As a matter of fact, after years of being told you're not welcome, you won't assume you're welcome. And this amendment does more than just say you won't be given a job solely because of the color of your skin. It says we can't even consider the color of your skin in deciding, do we want to have an armed services that reflects the diversity of the nation that it protects? And the way this amendment is written, I urge my colleagues to vote against it.
General yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. LaLota.
Thank you, Chairman. The gentlelady from Virginia speaks with passion, but I do want to correct some facts that were offered. According to usafacts.org and many other websites, every branch of the military, apart from the Marine Corps, had a higher overall representation of racial minorities than the United States population. However, representation varies depending upon service branch. In the Army, 21% of the soldiers are Black or African American, totaling 97,000 troops. The percentage is 50% higher than the 14% in the U.S. population, showing they have a more substantial presence in the Army. With respect to the Space Force, Mr. Chairman, it was the only branch with a higher proportion of Asian Americans in the U.S. population. The Navy has the most racially diverse military branch with 1.7 white service members for every non-white service member. So as we engage in this often passionate conversation, I just hope, Chairman, that we could do so in referencing solid facts. I yield.
Thank the gentleman. Any further discussion on this? Oh, Mr. Kim.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we had quite a few hearings in the Military Personnel Subcommittee tackling these types of issues. And one thing that I found particularly poignant when we addressed some of our military leaders about this is this question. We asked them, you know, what is the quantitative way in which we can determine what leadership means in our military? You know, how can you quantitatively determine merit? And that there's always going to be some subjectivity. There's something qualitative there in terms of who is going to be able to step up. And the way that our military leaders have addressed that is by taking this approach of the whole of person. And I think that just makes so much sense to us, that you're taking into account so many different facets of somebody and not reducing them down to just sheer numbers of marksmanship or other aspects of this, but we recognize that leadership is something greater than that. So I just strongly urge us to make sure that we're not limiting ourselves and finding ourselves in this place where we think that there is some magical list of quantitative assets that we can look at and assess, you know, promotions and other aspects of military leadership. We have to take into account the whole person and every part of them. So I think that that's something that I found really poignant and very strong coming from the military leaders that we talked to through these hearings, and I wanted to share that with the full committee. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the ranking member.
So I forgot one thing. One other aspect of this amendment is it puts in place protections for service members who claim actions were arbitrary or in reprisal, which means that anybody who is not promoted or doesn't get a job they think they should have got can now claim that it was because of this type of discrimination within the military and bring an action. I sure wouldn't want to be the commander of the unit who had to deal with that. I think that goes directly contrary to everything about service. I would hope that most Republicans would agree on that. So I think that is another huge problem with this amendment that would really undermine the ability of the military to do its job. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion?
Chairman.
Mr. Fallon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, listen, this is a touchy subject because of our history. And to my colleague, of course, there was systemic racism in this country. When you think about 1 million African-American, mostly men, that served in World War II, and then they come home to a country that doesn't welcome them. They come home to Jim Crow. They come home to a place where they can't eat where they want. They don't have the freedoms and the opportunities that other veterans had, and that is a shame. That was in 1945, and every day after that, it got a little bit better and a little bit better. And when you talk about recruiting, we do have a recruiting crisis, and we should absolutely 100% be recruiting from every pond and pool that we have available in this country. I fully support that. But merit's easy to, it may be hard to define, but it's easy to recognize. And I hate to use sports analogies in a serious topic like this, but there's many factors that go into, let's say, quarterback ratings. And it's interesting that the best quarterbacks have the highest ratings. And so when you're an employer, you can tell who your best employees are. And when you look at the higher the rank, the more the responsibility, and the more lives they are responsible for. So I would ask each member of this committee to hold yourself to the same standard that you would hold our military to. If you, God forbid, you needed life-saving brain surgery, it was you or one of your children or your spouse, you would have one standard for who that surgeon was going to be. You'd want the best. You wouldn't give a rat's nuggets about what they looked like, anything about what they were. You would want the best, who they were. Why can't we hold that, particularly when we're talking about general officers responsible for hundreds of thousands of lives in some instances? That's why merit has to be the preeminent consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Gentlelady Ms. Strickland.
Thank you, Chairman. Some of my colleagues seem to think that merit and diversity are mutually exclusive. It goes without saying that when someone is going for a promotion in leadership who is a person of color, they are highly likely extremely qualified, often overqualified. But I also want to point something out too. We talked about the Jim Crow South, and like Congresswoman McClellan, my father joined the Army as a young man when it was segregated. President Truman desegregated it in 1948. But let's fast forward to 2024. 70% of young adults aged 17 to 35 said it was fairly important or very important for them to work for an organization committed to racial and ethnic equality. And to my colleague who quoted numbers about the high proportion of people of color who are in the military, that is absolutely true among the enlisted ranks. But we're talking about officers and people in other ranks as well. So here's the message that we don't want to send to young people who are considering the military as a profession. We don't want to tell them they're not welcome here. We don't want to tell them that we will not take their entire life experience into consideration. And I will make this point again. Merit and diversity are not mutually exclusive. They are considerations that we make about the whole soldier. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Chair recognizes Mr. Bergman.
I yield to Representative Banks.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. It's interesting, shocking really, that the ranking member of this committee doesn't believe that a service member who believes that they've been discriminated against because of the color of their skin doesn't have a right to defend themselves. Really shocking to hear any member of the committee, especially the ranking member, suggest that a service member doesn't have that, shouldn't have that right as is spelled out in this amendment language. With that, I yield back to my colleague.
Any further debate? Seeing none, so many is in favor of the amendment will say aye. 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 Opposed, no? No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And we have a recorded vote request. The recorded vote will occur but be postponed until a later time. We will now consider log number 3727R1 by Mr. Banks of Indiana. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Will the clerk distribute the amendment? Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana for the purpose of explaining his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would reform the admissions process at the military service academies by focusing on objective criteria and aligning the academies with the Supreme Court's ruling on affirmative action. This amendment requires the academies to admit students based on objective whole candidate scores, based on grades, college entrance exams, extracurriculars, and athleticism. And this provision prohibits discrimination in admissions based on race or ethnicity. Currently, all the military service academies use race and ethnicity as selection criteria for admissions. Not only does this violate the Constitution, it violates the military's long-standing meritocratic principles and undermines public confidence in our military. The military service academies are elite universities which train and educate the future leaders of our armed forces. We need the best and brightest cadets and midshipmen regardless of their skin color or their ethnicity. ROTC already recruits from universities where race-based admission processes are banned. Officer candidate schools draw from a similar pool. Why shouldn't the service academies do the same? For our national security, we must uphold the ideals of our country and put hard work and service above all by restoring meritocracy to the service academies. I urge your support for this amendment. With that, I yield back.
All right. Mr. Horsford is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to speak against the proposed amendment, and I'm just going to speak to the fact that in June, the Supreme Court issued a fundamentally flawed decision in the Fair Admissions versus Harvard case. But even within that flawed decision, authored by Chief Justice Roberts and joined by all Republican-appointed justices, the Supreme Court created a carve-out for military academies based on the, quote, potentially distinct interest of taking race into account in their admissions. These potentially distinct interests that the Supreme Court alludes to are crucial for creating an inclusive and cohesive force that can fight today and tomorrow's battles. Today, my Republican colleagues are attempting to go further than what 6 conservative justices felt comfortable doing. This amendment would jeopardize the young talent that looks to serve at our nation's military academies. Even in February, when presented with the opportunity to decide on a case specific to the military academies, the Supreme Court did not do so. Once again, a conservative majority decided not to go as far as this amendment proposes. So it's unfortunate that today my colleagues on the other side are attempting to use this for whatever reason at the cost of young men and women. You know, one of the most honorable thing that I get to do in this role is when I get to call each of the young men and women, regardless of background, regardless of race, and to tell them that they're being formally nominated to the military academies. It's the most rewarding part of this job. And to those young men and women, I say, do not let this backwards amendment be a hindrance to your dreams. In my time in Congress, this is what I've enjoyed most, is nominating you to serve in our academies. You deserve to be there. We want these academies to be open and accessible and inclusive. It's an honor that has come with meeting young constituents and learning about the experience that have shaped them into the leaders that they are today. Many of those lived experiences have been shaped by their lived experience, including race and ethnicity, and have made them valuable additions to our academies. Since 1978, when the Supreme Court held that colleges and universities can administer race-conscious admission policies, our nation's schools, including our service academies, have been made better for it. So amendments like these do not address our national security issues. They do not promote the economic opportunity and security that joining the service can bring, and they definitely don't do anything to unify our nation and honor those who make the sacrifice to serve. Instead, these arguments will dissuade young people from applying to our service academies. So I urge my colleagues to stop using affirmative action as a cultural wedge issue to pit communities of color against one another, because our nation's greatest strength is, in fact, our diversity. While all who apply to our service academies are ready to serve our country, it is the whole of the person that makes them great leaders. Affirmative action is not radical. What is radical is denying our young people seeking to serve the opportunity to do so. So I urge a no vote on this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
I'm against DEI in our universities. I'm against DEI in our military. And for sure, I'm against DEI in the universities that exist to serve our military. And one of the worst incarnations of this DEI is race-based admissions. We should not have race-based admissions anywhere in the United States of America. And while the Supreme Court deferred that question, it's deferred to us, the policymakers. And our policies are best served when we have a system that is based on merit. Like, diversity is not the greatest strength of this country. Merit is. We are stronger because we've had the most meritorious ideas, the most entrepreneurial businesses, the best weapon systems, the bravest people. Like, there are a whole lot of pretty effective fighting forces throughout the time in human history that were highly capable and highly lethal, that weren't highly diverse. Not a lot says that that's the dispositive question on the battlefield. At the same time, while it's an honor for us to go and nominate folks to our service academies, an incredible honor, it's a stain on that honor when admissions isn't based on merit alone and on achievement alone. The reason it's an honor is because what you're telling a young person in your community is that their patriotism is worth a $500,000 investment from the U.S. taxpayer to advance their leadership opportunities and their service to the country. And when that's not because they're the best suited for it, but because we've embraced some race-based admission standard, I think it's indeed a stain on that honor. So I support Chairman Banks's amendment to get rid of race-based admissions at our military academies. I think he's done a great job rooting out a lot of DEI as chairman of our military personnel subcommittee, and I urge our Armed Services Committee to adopt the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. About 60 to 70% of students who enroll in our military academies are nominated by members of Congress. That gives, when you look at the numbers of who they appoint, it is disproportionately white. Right now, 74% of the nominations went to white students, even though 54% of the eligible student pool was white. Only about 8% went to Hispanic students, even though they make up 22% of the eligible pool. And only 6% went to Black students, even though that population is about 15% of the eligible pool. Do you really believe that merit is that disproportionate to the population? If so, we've got a bigger problem that we need to address. And what this amendment does, again, says you can't consider it at all. Does that mean that when I do my Military Service Academy Day, I can't go target students at Virginia State University? Would that be construed as making a decision based on race? Does that mean that I can't focus on trying to recruit more people to apply who are Black or Hispanic? We've got a problem in America we don't want to talk about. But burying our head in the sand and weaponizing DEI to score political points is not going to fix the problem of race in America. Focusing on making sure that our armed services reflects the diversity of the country it protects, and that the officer corps reflects the diversity of the country it protects will make us stronger and will make us safer. And amendments like this are counterproductive and, quite frankly, offensive. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McClellan hit on some of my points, and that we all get to a point and make recommendations. And I will tell you, in my recommendation process, I never look at the race of the candidate, but I do ask how many I had apply and based on race. And I get very few applicants that are African American, and it bothers me. I want you to know, it bothers me. And I say this only to bring back that reapportionment may have something to do with this, and the way the districts end up being so skewed one way or the other from the standpoint of who we see in our pools. I would suggest to you that we ought to take a look at who, there are a lot of members of Congress that don't take the nomination process serious. And Mr. Horsford, you said it's one of the biggest honors you have is calling your, for me too, it is. But we have members of Congress that don't even recommend or make nominations to the military academies. And I would just suggest to you that I think those people need to be called out. And I think that if we look at who's not making the nominations, that we would find a correlation there. And I don't want to make accusations. I want you to know it bothers me that I don't have more African American applicants going through the process. And when my son was playing high school football and I was talking to the coaches, I tried. And I think we can do better, but our pool's got to be bigger. I don't agree with it being the deciding factor, but I do agree that we need to do what we can to have more applicants. And so with that, I'll yield, but I do think we should take a look at who's not actually making nominations to the academies, and that may solve some of the problems.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Sherrill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I attended the Naval Academy, and I just want to make it incredibly clear to all of the children out there who are considering applying to our service academies, and certainly to all of the people at our service academies and then the people who go on into the fleet, that a lot of what I'm hearing here on this committee is in no way reflected in the fleet, because what I'm hearing here has such a horrible, corrosive effect on morale and how you might feel as a black member of our military. You might feel unwanted. That's kind of what I'm hearing across the aisle, is that is not who we want to make up our military force. And so to all of them, I just want to say to all of the people that are considering service that that's not what I hear reflected in our military. In fact, I had the real pleasure recently of speaking to the commanding officer of a group that is training future leaders. And what he said to me really resonated with me. He said, we are losing our qualitative military edge in many ways against many of our adversarial militaries. And yet the one area where we remain stronger than any other nation on earth is our people. It is our people that make us the greatest military on this earth. And he said, as he's training young leaders, that if you want to be a leader, he said, look, we train leaders here, and if you want to be a leader in our military, you need to be able to lead people who are a different race than you are, who are a different gender than you are, who express a different religious identity than you do, and who express their sexuality differently than you do. And if you cannot lead those people, then you have no place in our military. So I think it's important for people to hear throughout our military that many people value your service, despite what you may be hearing occasionally from this committee, and I yield back.
Mr. Jimenez.
Thank you, and I'm going to vote in favor of this for a number of reasons. And I'm Hispanic, and this country has given me, so much. And it's not because I'm Hispanic; it's because of what I can do. I find it offensive to me personally that somehow you think I need a helping hand. I don't need a helping hand. I can do it all by myself. DEI, diversity. Yeah, I think diversity in America is great. Inclusion is great. Equity, there's the problem, all right? Because equity allows you to be inequitable. You can do anything you want in the name of equity, and that's not the American way. The American way is actually, hey, go out, get an education, work hard, and you know what? You'll be rewarded at the end, no matter who you are. And so, for me, I don't care who's in that fighter. I don't care what color, gender, et cetera they are. I just want them to be the best. And to say that somehow I got to give some group a leg up, I find that also offensive, because everybody here can compete. Anybody in the United States can be anything they want to be. You can't be a colorblind society if you are color conscious. If that drives your decision, that means that you're not a colorblind society. And we need to get to a colorblind society where everybody knows that they can get to wherever they want through their own, sweat equity, intelligence, studying. I just find it amazing that, we need help. I need help. You need to give me a helping hand. Thank you very much. I don't need your helping hand. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Slotkin.
I think it's important, given that this amendment is trying to overturn what the Supreme Court enshrined a year ago, what Justice Roberts enshrined a year ago, which was keeping a reflection of diversity in receiving applicants and approving applicants into our service academies, where that came from. And I would offer that everyone who served in uniform on this committee has served under one of the 35 people, the 35 four-star generals, who wrote a letter, an amicus brief to the Supreme Court. Joe Dunford, Bill McRaven, Dick Myers, Mike Mullen, Hugh Shelton, people who served and were nominated and appointed under both Democratic and Republican administrations, 35 military leaders who told the Supreme Court in no uncertain terms that if the court constrained our ability to recruit and retain a diverse officer corps, it would damage our ability to fight and win our nation's wars. Those retired officers wrote, quote, "History has shown that placing a diverse armed forces under the command of a homogeneous leadership is a recipe for internal resentment, discord, and violence. By contrast, units that are diverse across all levels are more cohesive, collaborative, and effective." So the author of the amendment and others who are supporting it, who have not served and led in these exact scenarios, are four-star leadership making this recommendation, and Justice Roberts listened to those leaders and even acknowledged their amicus brief specifically in the Supreme Court opinion, eliminating racial considerations for most admissions in our military academies. I just think that if we're trying to understand how to lead the best fighting force in the world, we need to listen to the people who have actually led the best fighting force in the world. That's the collective 3- and 4-star generals of the last 35 years. They're represented in this brief. And I recommend that everyone check themselves before voting for this amendment. The idea that the system right now is based exclusively on merit with the numbers that we have in our officer corps does not reflect reality. So if you want to do something that protects the strength of the military, listen to the 3- and 4-star generals, listen to Chief Roberts, and I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We all have our own unique experiences that form who we are and what our opinions are of this very controversial topic. I'm no stranger to that myself. Most of you know that I was in the military for over 20 years myself, and my first experience was applying for a scholarship for the Marines, which I lost to my high school buddy, who happened to be African American, because he was better than I was. He got the scholarship, not me. And the only person left in the military that's still around after all these years, because I'm getting old now, is a guy named Brian Kavanaugh, who's now a 3-star general, who happens to be African American because he got promoted faster than I, because he was better than I was. There's my two experiences in the Marine Corps. What's interesting, as a Marine officer instructor who taught at Morehouse College, who taught at Spelman, who taught at Clark Atlanta and Morris Brown before it was defunct, my experience was very difficult to keep my cadets in the ROTC unit when they went to do internships at Koch, and they were offered huge sums of money because everybody wanted to recruit them. Everybody wants diversity. It's good for business, and it's good for the military too. I want diversity in the military, and I think we should recruit accordingly. I really do. Absolutely put your focus on that and try to recruit the best people out there, because you're going to be competing against Coca-Cola and some of the best IT people and the best salespeople out there, because diversity is good for business and it's good for the military. But what I would hate to see is that somebody looks at my friend Calvin Austin or Brian Kavanaugh and says, man, you're there because you were a quota, not because you were that good. I want to see that they believe that these guys were better than me, that they deserved it because they're just that good. And that's been my experience, and that's what I want to make sure that when we say we believe in merit, I believe these guys are better. I believe that they are the best. And I believe that's why they got recruited, they got the scholarship, and they got the promotion that they deserved. And I don't think there's anything wrong with supporting a merit-based system based on that. And as a matter of fact, I think it would be really good if we focused on making people feel more patriotic about their country, about the flag, so they believe that they wanted to join the military, instead of thinking that it represents the worst of us. So I think our efforts should really be focused on going out there and recruiting the right people, recruiting diversity, making people feel good about this great country of ours, and that it's worth defending. And that will be our best recruiting tool of all. Thank you. With that, I yield.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I take great personal pride in nominating students from my district each year to the military service academies. An effort to undermine the ability of members of Congress to select academic candidates in their districts, the districts that I know best. I know my district better than anyone. And to suggest that I don't is harmful. Selection is already rigorous, merit-based process. Suggesting that a candidate score and the merit are not at the core of the process is misleading. I think one of our colleagues said it best. Merit and race are not mutually exclusive. And I really want to lean in to something that our Republican colleague from Georgia said. We should all be trying to do better outreach in trying to find the very best candidates to attend our military academy. When the Air Force Academy class is only 4% Black, you can't tell me that our military or our service academies spend too much time, too much money, or too much attention on diversity. We only can win when we have the very best players on the field. And there is no way you can tell me that 4% minority or 4% Black represents the very best that we could do. I submit to you it does not. And given the level of vitriol in our comments today, I can only think that it will set back my efforts to try to recruit the very best and brightest from my district. And that is truly worrisome to me. And not only is this amendment harmful, I think it's hateful. And I urge my colleagues to oppose it. I want to yield the rest of my time to the gentlewoman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think something that the gentleman, Mr. Jimenez from Florida, said underlies a real misconception that that side of the aisle has about what equity is and what it isn't. Equity is not about giving someone a leg up. Equity is recognizing that for 350 years, Black men and women had a boot on their neck. That for 350 years, Black men and women weren't given access to the American dream. For 350 years, Black men and women were denied the ability to build generational wealth. Were denied the ability to educate their children. Were denied the ability to be chosen for merit. Equity is about first recognizing that fact and then doing something about it. And unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle think that when laws changed, a magic wand got rid of the inequity. It didn't. It didn't. But we have tools at our disposal we can use to address it in our education system, in every system. And what this amendment does is say, we're not even going to allow you to consider what barriers somebody had in their way and whether they can be overcome. Because you fundamentally don't understand what equity is all about. And I hope at some point we can fix that. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Fallon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I have to say that our greatest strength in this country, greatest country history's ever known, isn't diversity, it's equal opportunity. And talent, skill, and ability comes in all shapes, sizes, and shades. And I was writing some notes a few minutes ago and wrote about, I think it's ironic in some sense because we seem to have the same goal, just two different pathways. And then I heard one of my colleagues talk about the fact that there are some members of this committee that don't want Americans of certain extractions to feel welcome in the military. And then my heart started racing, and I got angry, and my blood started boiling, because that is a condescending, lazy, and wholly inaccurate, ludicrous, and absurd shot. That has no bearing whatsoever. I agree that we should be looking at the whole person and their experience, not their pigmentation. Because let's be very honest here, this country, I think, is far more classist than it is has anything to do with having racial issues. For instance, you could have somebody that came from a very wealthy background, pampered, given all the opportunities and advantages, and they might happen to be African American. And you could have somebody, and there are folks like that, and there are other folks that have come from abject poverty, broken homes, abusive families, that could happen to be white. And in that particular instance, if you look at the whole person's experience, that's fine. But it shouldn't be that, in that case, the African American shouldn't given any advantage over that particular person that happens to be Caucasian. It's about their life experience. And we do root for the underdog in this country. And so when I heard vitriol and hateful in this committee, I haven't seen vitriol, I haven't seen hate. I've seen love of country, I've seen disagreements on occasion, and I've seen a lot of respect across the aisle. So I think that we should sharpen our comments and not devolve into some of these other committees that we all see, of which I sit on one. I know this is a delicate topic, and we should learn from the past, but one of my colleagues made a very good point too, that if you want to recruit from all segments of our society, you're not going to fight for a country or serve a country if you don't believe in it, if you don't believe that it is on balance good for the world. And you see it a lot, particularly on these college campuses of late, that there's not a love of country, there's a hate of country. You're not going to get anybody that's suspect, that has those kinds of suspicions about the United States of America to sign up and serve. So promoting patriotism is one way to solve this issue as well. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Chair recognizes Mr. Vasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to talk just briefly here on a success story of diversity in our military. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the Navajo Code Talkers, but between 400 and 500 Native Americans helped win a number of decisive victories in World War II in the Pacific Theater, not because perhaps they won some type of meritocracy, but because they spoke languages that enabled us to encrypt messages that gave us an advantage against the Axis powers, which was incredibly important. Now, this primarily includes the Navajo, but it also includes the Lakota, the Muscogee, the Mohawk, Comanche, Tlingit, Hopi, Cree, and Crow soldiers. They were chosen to serve our military based on the merits of who they were and the language that they spoke. Now, I would argue that when we talk about diversity in our armed forces, it also has to do about gelling together with folks that represent a diverse nation together, that can speak similar languages, that share different experiences, that offer different opportunities. Now, when we operate in places across the world, we need folks who speak the language of the countries that we operate in. We need folks who are going to lead troops and lead in those missions, in those places, because they can speak the language and they understand the culture and they know how to deal with those appropriately cultural experiences. And so I would argue that diversity makes us stronger. Now, the Navajo Code Talkers were not honored until 1968. They were not honored until 1968. Most of them are gone today, but we honor their service because they helped us win the toughest war this country's ever fought, and it was because diversity made us stronger, and that continues to be the story today. We just have to look at it from that perspective of different races, different experiences, different ethnicities that make this country stronger. So I oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman, yield.
Chair recognizes gentleman Mr. Alford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I love this discussion that we're having. I think it's important. Some of you have probably seen on Instagram a post of a line drawing that's done in pen and ink. And you're asked to look at this drawing and you see initially a tree. But then when you look closer, you see two old people kissing. I think that's where we are with the race relations in America right now. We have the same picture, but different perspectives and different lenses that we're looking at. And where we're asked to see something a different way, there might be a hesitancy towards that, but the image is definitely there. And so I don't want to take away anything from any of the arguments made by the other side of the aisle. Ms. McClellan, I have the utmost respect for you. I think there is a disparity in our military academies right now. But I don't think it's disproportionate to necessarily who we represent. In the 4th District of Missouri, I represent 772,047 people. And I don't care if they're Democrat, Republican, independent, agnostic, they all get the same service from our offices. And so it's the same with our military academy appointments. The greatest pleasure that I have had as a freshman congressman is to be able to call up the 6 individuals this year and tell them that your life is going to be changed forever because you are going to a military academy. We have very skilled panelists on our panel. Frank Cavuti, a lieutenant colonel, U.S. Air Force retired. Andrew Swedberg, lieutenant colonel, U.S. Army. Perry Johnson, commander, U.S. Navy. And Steve Alms, captain, U.S. Coast Guard. And Grace Townsend, working with our office, who's also a veteran, who coordinates this. And you know, not one time has race ever come up. And I don't even know the race of the individuals when I call them. I've looked at the information, I've looked at the recommendations from the panelists. But it's based solely on, are they mentally fit? Are they physically fit? Do they have the gumption to stick with it, to be a good investment for our taxpayers of this $500,000 education? I think this is something that we have to look at. I agree with Mr. Scott. How do we increase minority participation? How do I get, we're struggling all the time. We've got this great academies that we're trying to get people into, and we struggle sometimes getting people to even file these applications. Maybe that's on us to do a better job. And I'm going to take the information that we are talking about here today, and I'm going to try to do a better job of that. But I want to say something in regards to what Ms. Sherrill says. And ma'am, I don't know you, but the intimation I got from your statement was that some on our committee do not want Black Americans in our military. And I'm sorry if I misunderstood that, but I want to make one thing very clear if anyone's out there listening right now or watching. I don't care what color you are or where you're from, we want you and we need you in our military. We have only 9% of American young people right now having any interest in joining the military. And we are up against some serious foes in the future. We've got to get our act together as Americans. We've got to be able to see both drawings inside that Instagram post. We've got to do better as a nation. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I recognize that this is an extended discussion, but one, I think it's important, and two, I want to be clear who introduced this topic and who decided to bring this up. I think that is also important. It's incredibly disappointing, having served, having graduated from one of our service academies, now representing one of our service academies, that rather than focusing our collective time on the real wars happening and that our troops are preparing for, God forbid they have to go into them, we are continuing to fight culture war BS. It's disappointing, especially given the comments my colleagues have made, reminding us of the Supreme Court's explicit carve-out. You heard from Mr. Horsford and Ms. Slotkin compellingly, but I think it's important to reiterate. Certainly not a radical conservative Justice Roberts calling out a, quote, distinct interest. So what is that distinct interest? I think we can all agree and acknowledge that implicit in that was national security, keeping our country safe, keeping Americans safe, creating the most lethal fighting force on the planet. What goes into that? That's the work of this committee, as we know, training, equipment, but cohesion, which some of my colleagues have mentioned, is so critical to that. And foundational to cohesion, I believe, as did all the senior ranking officers mentioned by Ms. Slotkin, is an officer corps reflective of the troops that they're going to lead in harm's way, whose trust they have to earn. And my colleagues who have served in uniform, regardless of party, you know when you look your soldiers in the eye and you have to ask them to do something incredibly dangerous and risky, it is about trust. That's not exclusively built, of course, on any one factor, but to take any factor away from the ability to build trust and cohesion will absolutely do harm to our national security. For example, right now in the Army, Black and Latino troops represent 38% of our enlisted service members in the Army. Through much work in progress, now 20% of our officer corps in the Army are Black and Latino, 17% of general officers. As many have said, that has not happened by accident. It's happened with work and a commitment to have the troops being led by those who can identify with them across multiple dimensions. I believe, and I think many of my colleagues as well, not only is this the morally right thing to do, but is practically and materially strengthens our force out of many, one, to the points about patriotism is something I think we can all agree upon as Americans. So this, again, in closing, is a deliberate decision in introducing this amendment to take us backwards to a time where we were much further from the goals outlined in our Constitution that I fought for, and I think many of us did as well. And I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. With my balance of time, I want to yield it to my Naval Academy colleague, Mr. DeLuzio.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. I'll add, and I associate myself with your remarks and so many others in opposition to the amendment. I'll add one piece of this, and I say this as a Naval Academy grad, but also someone who interviewed applicants to the Naval Academy before my time in Congress, and like my colleagues here, I have the great honor now of nominating folks. People come to seek out an academy appointment from different walks of life, from different backgrounds, from different wealth in their homes. They may have experienced sexism or racism or whatever else they might have gone through, and that matters to their ability to succeed. It matters to whether they might not have had the same advantages of others, but have the potential to succeed. And one piece of this in particular in the amendment that I think goes quite another direction of locking in advantage is the requirement in the amendment that 30%, at least 30% of the composite score for admissions has to be standardized testing, when we know that the wealth of a child's family is strongly determinative and correlates with their SAT scores in particular. So it's locking in advantage for rich kids that others just don't have that same opportunity and might be able to succeed if they're given a chance. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Mr. Veasey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I'm glad that we're having this discussion. We need to. I think that is obviously the reason why we're here. And I just want to touch on one of the most influential names in politics died last year, and it didn't get a lot of coverage in the media. But Kevin Phillips died, and he was Richard Nixon's key man on race. And he had a quote that I think that we're still living with today, because although we're past a lot of the bad things that happened during the 60s, we're certainly dealing with a lot of the after effects of it. And he said the whole secret of politics is who hates who. And that's why we're discussing this. My good friend from North Texas, Mr. Fallon, he talked about football and about how it's pure meritocracy in football. But I remember when Mr. Fallon was playing football, and People didn't think that his quarterback could play in the NFL. And his quarterback went to go play in the Canadian Football League because there was still this mentality that blacks did not have the intelligence to play NFL football. And I think from the ranking member's alma mater, there may have been just Warren Moon. He may have been out there all by himself. But that was like it. And that was something that was, people think that was a long time ago. People think that was in the 50s and 60s. No, in the 1980s, people didn't think that blacks had the intelligence to play quarterback and that we couldn't read offenses. And people had to start talking about that and discussing it. And the NFL had to put in protocols. And that's all we're asking the military to do, is just look at ways how they can increase diversity. What worries me about this amendment the most, honestly, is to me it looks like this could also hurt people that live in more agrarian societies and in more rural states. If we're looking at these composite scores and things like that, because you think it's only going to hurt black people and that it's not going to affect your election, your electoral outcome, but it certainly could. The other reason why I'm going to oppose this amendment, again, we need to study our history more. Back during the Vietnam War, one of the things that the Viet Cong would do routinely is that they would send messages out telling black soldiers, why are you fighting? Why are you out here? You're going to go back to America and be told to sit in the back of the bus. You're going to go back to America and be told that you can't marry whoever you're dating. You're going to go back to America and be told all these things. And there was real concern on the Republican and Democratic side, both aisles, that that message was going to resonate and that this communist influence was going to be spread into the United States because we could not handle our own act good enough at home. We don't want to go back to that because I guarantee you if something goes down, and hopefully we will never see anything on the scale of Vietnam or World War II ever again. Hopefully that won't happen. But I guarantee you that we're not going to be having this discussion because all of us, Republican and Democrats that are sitting in this room, whether we're in office or out of office, just like I mentioned before in previous discussions about the Negro soldier in the 1940s that the military begged Frank Capra to produce to try to get blacks to become more involved because we were living in the middle of discrimination. If something goes down, we ain't going to even be having this discussion. We're going to all be on the same page. We're going to be like, well, how can we get more black officers? Because the people in European communists or China communism, they're using this rhetoric saying that there aren't enough black officers, and so why should black people be fighting this war? So that's what's going to happen. So let's just be realistic. Let's be honest and admit that this is about politics. And I want to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Horsford of Nevada. Mr.
Thank you. I just want to point out that no one on the other side has refuted the U.S. Supreme Court's decision, which was led by Chief Justice Roberts, providing for this potentially distinct interest exclusion regarding our military academies and what your amendment would do to overturn your Supreme Court's decision on this issue. Secondly, no one is lowering the bar to get into the military academies. We know it's rigorous, and it's becoming more rigorous. I've had applicants who have been denied and who have tried 2 and 3
not recognized as gentlelady, Ms.
and gone
Escobar.
through prep academies.
Gentleman's time's expired. Ms. Escobar is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to associate myself with the remarks of my HASC Democratic colleagues on this issue. I have yet to hear a problem articulated by the other side of the aisle with regard to why we need this workaround for a Supreme Court decision. What I have heard some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle say is that you embrace diversity. I've heard a couple of you say you embrace diversity. You want to see that diversity. One of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle even said he's looking for ways in his own district to increase diversity. This would have the opposite effect. This would not address those challenges articulated by those colleagues on the other side of the aisle, this would only make that challenge far greater. I think it is really unfortunate that we are having to spend so much time talking about this issue of how we eliminate, or actually how we work around a decision by the Supreme Court that is in place in order to ensure that our service academies create the diversity that represents our great nation and that will open doors for all of our future leaders in different parts of the country. I represent an incredible community that is 85% Latino, that is economically disadvantaged, and the young people in my community have very different opportunities, or lack thereof, than people their age in other communities. We have to recognize the inherent inequity that exists in our country, and instead of trying to move the clock backward, we should be leaning in and seeking avenues and ways to ensure that every great young woman and man in our country has the opportunities that some of you have articulated you'd like to see expanded. I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to my colleague, Steven Horsford.
Thank you to my colleague from Texas. I just wanted to reiterate, and I hope we all agree, and I would love to work with my colleagues on the other side to figure out a way that we can all improve our outreach, our engagement, because this is actually one of the difficult areas. One of our subcommittees looked into this specific issue about recruitment into our military academies. But I just wanted to underscore that we have the rigor for military academies is high. And there's somehow an assumption that when you look at diversity, that means there's less rigor. They still have to meet the minimum requirements to get in. And I've had applicants from every background, of every race, who have not gotten in their first time, their second time, their third time. But they go to prep academies, they do the work during the interim, and they reapply. That is how great the people of America are. They don't give up on their hopes and their dreams. And so we have to keep these opportunities open and available in a way that's inclusive for everyone. And again, I would urge my colleagues to reject this amendment, and let's do the right thing and promote our military academies for everybody.
And before I yield back, I would just ask those colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have expressed an interest in maintaining diversity in our service academies and who have actually said they seek ways to increase diversity in our academies to please vote against this amendment. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
There's no further debate. The question occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Banks. Those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recorded votes requested. Recorded vote will be postponed to a later date. I had hoped we would make much more progress and have a vote series before 4:30, but we just spent 2 hours on that amendment. So we probably will have our next vote series after, what? Okay,